Hey, it's Alex Kazai from Render Better, and in this video, I'm going to show you how you can monitor your web performance better and use tools like PageSpeed Insights, Google Search Consoles, and others to take a closer look at your web performance and get a better understanding of what's working for your site, what's not, and how to actually dig into the issues that these tools are showing you. Now, in order to walk you through this, I'm actually going to use an example report that I put together for one of our clients called Vitamin A, and I'm going to walk you through that, as well as at the end of the video, after I go through that report, I'm even going to dive in and kind of show you how I would debug it live before passing it on to our developers to take a look at and fix. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's dive in. So let's go ahead and dive in. We'll start with the Google Search Console first. Like I said, I'll probably just pull up the tools because it'll be easier, but I won't be able to show you the previous necessarily because it was in the past. So this is a screenshot of your core web vitals from Google Search Console on January 20th, so a little over a month ago. That was the most recent one I had. It doesn't necessarily mean there was a big change on this date. It's just when I went in and took some screenshots just to see where things were tracking. And then this is where it's currently at. And so let me just pull that up live because it'll be easier to show this live, I would assume, and also show you how to get there yourself. So again, this is Search Console here, and the tab that I'm on after I selected Vitamin A is just down here called Core Web Vitals. So you can see an overview here, and let me just close that. You can see mobile and desktop. And if you remember from that screenshot, basically what's happening here is good news. Previously, there were a bunch of red URLs, and now a majority of those red URLs have shifted to yellow. On desktop, it's pretty much held steady at yellow and green. What we're looking to accomplish here is get the majority of URLs into either a yellow or green zone, because within yellow or green, Google provides some ranking boost to those URLs. They've not said how much of a boost, and from what we've seen, it's kind of hard to tell, so it probably is minimal, but they are keeping an eye on this, and they will now provide a boost to both the mobile version and desktop versions based on how well they are performing. So if it's in the red, it doesn't mean it's penalized. It just means those URLs won't receive a web performance ranking boost benefit based on their latest update. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, it just means you're missing out on a little bit of extra opportunity there for slightly better rankings, a little more traffic. But again, Google has not explicitly said how much of a benefit it is. But even though it looks a little dramatic here with all the red, yellow going on, what I could see is that, and I'll talk about it as we're going through the other tools through my investigation, I found that really the only issue is CLS, and that's one of the web performance metrics that measures how much content shifts around the page. However, for your site in particular, I would say it's pretty much irrelevant, at least in terms of user experience, because your site loads so incredibly fast that the shifting around is going to be pretty much unnoticeable and not really cause that much of an impact to the user. However, Google does factor it in as one of the core web vitals when they're looking at whether or not the URL passes or fails. So if the URL simply doesn't pass on one of the metrics, it holds it back, even if it's great for the others. And you can see that by opening the report and kind of checking all the different statuses. You can see the only thing holding back your URLs is CLS. And if we're to dive in and, for example, look at the poor ones, you can see that it's primarily collections and product pages that are holding it back, collections being one of the biggest ones in terms of the aggregate. You can kind of look at this number as like a percentage. So what this would be is roughly 64% of the content on a collection page is shifting around when it's loading in or as a user is scrolling on it. And so a good way to think about that is if you go to a news site and you see like ads pop in or images load in slowly, and then all of a sudden the text shifts that you were trying to read, or you accidentally click on the wrong button because it shifted to somewhere else on the page, that's CLS. So again, it can be frustrating from a user experience standpoint, but your site is remarkably fast, so it's probably not going to be that noticeable. However, for example, even if this collection page here is extremely fast for FCP, LCP, and FID, so it loads fast, it's fast to interact with, even if all that's fantastic and this is still high, Google's going to mark it as a red URL. Kind of dumb in my opinion, but I get why they do that. They want you to meet the good thresholds on all the metrics. So again, there's two benefits we're really aiming here for web performance: is a better user experience, and then the site ranking benefit from Google in that order. CLS being kind of one of the least important metrics, but unfortunately still can sometimes hold us back and be tricky. There is a balancing act here though, because you could change up the design of the site to just try to tweak these pages into the green. for CLS, but changing the design might not necessarily be a better user experience. It might be better for the robots because they don't see as much content shifting around, but changing up the design could potentially lower conversion. So it is a balancing act and could be a trade-off that's not really worth it, which is why we're careful to play around with CLS too much if everything else is performing really well. If we go back to desktop, you'll see it's a similar issue. The majority of the URLs are either yellow and green, which means they're already receiving some ranking benefit. And then of course CLS is continuing to hold things back a bit on products and collections. From my understanding and talking with James, the Vitamin A site, has a lot of intricacies in its design. It's very beautifully designed. And so, from my perspective, even though this is holding back some of the URLs, I wouldn't necessarily say it's an issue, but maybe there's a little bit of room for improvement that we could try tweaking the designs without altering them too much to not only appease, the robots, but make sure that we're still providing a solid user experience. So that's what's going on inside of Search Console in case you were to take a look and you wondered what was going on there. If you have any questions, please let me know. And then PageSpeed Insights is another tool we look at because it kind of gives us an idea of an overall average of where things were, where they are now. So if you were to throw in a site to PageSpeed Insights, which I did here, for example, earlier today, what most people do is they leave it on the mobile tab and they leave it on this URL, and that's as far as they go. But there's actually 4 different settings. You can look at mobile for home and origin, as well as desktop for home and origin. And you could even throw in an individual URL. But depending on how much traffic the URL receives, it might not have the real user data up here. But given that it's a large site and it's the home page, it's guaranteed to have enough data up here. So these metrics, just like Search Console, they're kind of averaged up over a 28-day period, which is why it's a much better measure of success than the lab data, which is what's shown below, because this is just what a Google server says the performance is at the moment I tested. So this number is like a simulated experience, and it's also a simulated worst case scenario. It's in no way indicative of what the real user is experiencing. However, because it can be run instantly, it can help predict what might happen to performance for real users. But you'll notice that, for example, like FCP and LCP of 1.3 and 3.9, it's far different than what it's showing here, 1.4, 7.9 for this simulated experience. So your users it's not taking them nearly 8 seconds to see large images, for example. It's closer to the 1.92 second threshold. And the good threshold for these metrics, by the way, is 1.8, 2.5. I think this one's 100 milliseconds, I believe. Forgive me if I'm wrong there, but I believe it's 100 milliseconds. The graph is kind of deceiving, but I believe it's 100 milliseconds. And then the CLS is 0.1. So again, even though it looks kind of far, like you're far away from it, the scale is from 0 to 1, and you're at 0.16 here on average, on the homepage. On average, you're higher, you're at the 0.3, and that's because the collections and products are pulling up that average, because the homepage is a lot less. But you can see that your site on average, blazing fast, right? Like the homepage is a little bit slower, but on average, 1.2, 1.7, that's well within the green threshold and blazing fast speeds. Also we've done a lot of work on this site, so I would hope so. And again, if I change it to the mobile origin, it doesn't matter up here, this URL or origin, because all this is looking at is the home page in the instant I ran the test. We tell people to just kind of avoid looking at this number, honestly, because it really only helps if you're looking at it as an overall trend, which we'll show you here in a little bit that we do in our dashboards. But just measuring it one moment in time isn't super helpful, and also this number can be manipulated very easily with some tweaking when you're running the test and some tweaking in the code. So it's not super helpful in terms of measuring success, but it can help predict things sometimes or debug things when we're testing. Likewise on desktop, kind of similar story, right? Even though the score is better over here, it's kind of irrelevant that it's better than the other Lighthouse speed score. And by the way, the Shopify speed score is based on this similar data here, this Lighthouse data. It's just that it's looking at your home collections and products combined and then factored into their own formula that spits out a number. So again, it's lab data, not real user data. But looking at your real user data here, your homepage is blazingly fast, passing on all metrics, and then your site-wide is super fast. 1 second, 1.6 and 8 is incredible. It's just that the CLS is again holding them back. So I know it's kind of scary because it says failed up here, but it's it doesn't matter if just one of these metrics is slightly in the yellow, it's gonna give you a failed. So kind of dumb, because it's almost like 3 greens and a yellow average out to red, but that's not really what it's indicating. It's just that based on how Google looks at it, it's saying that on average you're not passing for every metric. But again, this is like a site-wide average versus what we're looking at here, which is an individual URL basis. So this kind of gives you a summary, but this is really what Google's looking at when they're determining that site ranking benefit for each URL. And so now we'll kind of look at what's going on like before and after. So if we look at previous, you can kind of see it was 1 and 1.5 on mobile site-wide, and now it's 1.2, 1.7. As well as the interactivity went up a little bit. So the CLS went down by about 0.1, but it's taking a little bit longer for things to load. So again, that could have been due to some design changes, maybe some code changes, or additional third parties. It's still well within the green. And by the way, getting it further into the green makes no difference to Google, but it does make a difference to real users, of course. But for how Google sees it, green is green. It doesn't matter how green or how little green. Desktop, kind of similar story of what happened, 1 and 1.5 for the loading speeds, and you can see it's now 1 and 1.6. So FCP and LCP basically are measuring how fast or how long it takes to see the first piece of content, which would usually be like the menu or the logo, and LCP is looking at the largest piece of content, which would be generally a product image, banner image, featured image, or a big block of text. And then FID looks at how fast the site responds when you click. So at 8 milliseconds, if I click on the site and the site does something, that's instant to the human brain. So this is blazing fast and great. It's just that CLS shifting that again is holding some things back. So yes, it does appear that over the past, a little bit over a month here, I would say a month and a half, the site's gotten a little bit slower in terms of FCP and LCP, but it's still really great. But it also means it's something we want to keep an eye on, because we don't want it to keep getting slower than that and pop out into the yellow zone. So this is where I was talking about we look at our own dashboards as well. So these are our internal dashboards that we have that I have pulled up here. This one's, however, looking at last 6 months, whereas the screenshots are looking at the last 90 days. But it does give us kind of an idea of what's been happening. And so this is where the lab data can be helpful, because we can kind of look at it as a trend. Again, if you just measure it at one point in time, you can kind of see how wildly scattered these data points are. So it's hard to say for sure, unless you're looking at a trend, that something is going on. And what I can see here over the last 6 months is that performance is really stable in terms of that Lighthouse lab data score across all your page types, which you can see over here on the side. But recently, towards the beginning of February, there was a little bit of a drop for, it looks like the blue here, which is homepage, which kind of pulled down the site-wide average. And I would say roughly all of them dropped a little bit. But yeah, there has been a little bit of a drop and a new baseline established, it seems. So this is something that we'll want to look into, but before I worry about it too much, I like to see, okay, well, how did that impact the real user data? So these are the individual metrics. You can see it looks like it's primarily due to LCP was damaging the score, but some other things are kind of spiking and having some issues. So again, something that's crept up here in the past few weeks and that we'll want to look into, but wasn't, mostly because it wasn't previously an issue. So I'm curious what's going on. If it was a third party, a change we made to the designer code, maybe an update Shopify did, I'm not 100% certain. So definitely something we will keep an eye on. Now, real user data, these are the same 4 metrics we were just looking at on PageSpeed Insights. So we're looking at mobile here, basically what you're seeing here in this FCP, LCP. So these numbers right here, we've been gathering this data on a daily basis, and that's what's being spit out over here into this real user data. Now, what's interesting is that the site-wide and homepage look really good. In fact, it looks like, they were getting better. But then in February, not necessarily that they were, getting really bad, but they were starting to curve back up. But you can see compared to prior months in the past 6 months, it's still better. So that's really good in my opinion. But what's interesting is we have a couple data points here now for collections. Now, it won't necessarily show this data unless there's enough traffic to those individual pages. And so that's why usually we're only able to see homepage and site-wide here, but it looks like the collections are now starting to get enough traffic on some days to show data points. However, there's not a whole lot of data points, so it's kind of hard to tell, but you can see that the collections has definitely shot up, and fairly dramatically, honestly, in the past couple of weeks. So that's really interesting to me, because the collection pages weren't really dipping here that much on lab data. But I do know the collections for sure have CLS issues, which is very apparent because it's way outside the red pour threshold here. And it's definitely what's pulling, well, a big factor of what's pulling up the CLS, or sorry, the site-wide average for CLS, which is exactly what we saw when we were looking in Search Console. So our dashboards are telling us the same story that Search Console is. And I would say if there was any room for improvement to really pull back down site-wide averages, it's collection pages. Collections are what are in the most recent weeks here have really pulled up the site-wide average and what caused these numbers to go up a little bit across the board. Interestingly though, the CLS average went down, but from what I can see here, I think collections is what we want to focus on moving forward. Alright, so in the previous section I was showing you that collection pages were a fairly big issue recently for this site, vitaminaswim.com. So I'm just going to go ahead and walk you through how I would actually look at it live before passing it to our developers. And so we identified that collections seem to be the primary issue. So usually what I try to do is find a collection that's most likely, one of the highly visited collection pages. And so for example, if I just go to shop here and let's just go ahead and click on this, I would probably pick bestsellers or one of the ones they have mentioned here. So I'm just going to go with bestsellers because most definitely this is probably a page that gets a lot of traffic. So this is one that we would want to look at, be a pretty good example. And so typically what I like to do is I like to look at the mobile first to debug, mainly because our dashboards that you saw, those internal dashboards, those are looking at mobile data. Typically as well, if we can fix the load time issues on mobile, that will fix it on desktop. Now for CLS, the cumulative layout shifts, sometimes that can differ between mobile and desktop, but sometimes it's the same depending on what's causing the shifting issues. So one thing that you can do that's pretty simple is if you're on this page, you can right click on a blank spot and pick inspect. You can also go to view up here and you can go to developer and then you can go to developer tools. That's another way to get to it. So let's just go ahead and pop open the developer tools here. And what I've got it on right now is a Pixel 5, but I could change this. Let's just go ahead and do an iPhone 12 Pro. That's probably a pretty common phone that people are using. If you were to inspect, by default it'd be on the Elements tab, and what I'm on over here is the Network tab right now. And so normally you won't have this, but there's two settings that I do is I will do this disable cache. So normally it's unchecked and I check it. And then normally this is set to no throttling under the network. So typically this is what it would look like, unchecked and then no throttling. I like to disable the cache, that way it's basically testing a first load, because sometimes the issues are first load only, and then oftentimes I'll slow it down so I can get a better understanding of what's going on. But before I do that, we'll do a test run without throttling just to see what it looks like at a normal connection speed. Now additionally down here you'll probably not have these tabs. In order to pull this up, you can press escape, and that's kind of a shortcut to pull up this panel. Also, the rendering usually isn't there. Typically, it's just on console. That's what most people are familiar with. But if you click this little menu and you open up rendering, this is super helpful because then you can go in and start kind of getting a visual representation of what's going on a bit easier. So one of the things that you can do is you can check Core Web Vitals here, and it'll actually display the Core Web Vitals as the page is loading. Now, it kind of sucks because it overlays the top, so it's not really the best. It'd be nicer if they put it off to the side, but it does kind of cover up the top of the page. And then the other thing you can do is you can look at the layout shift regions here, and that's going to highlight stuff in kind of a bluish purple color as things are loading in to show you what part of the page is shifting around. So again, without throttling, I'm just going to go ahead and refresh this page. Okay, and you can kind of see the blue shifting, so there's definitely a lot of shifting going on down here, and that caused a pretty big spike. We got like the 0.50. But again, it was kind of hard to tell what was going on because things were going quite a bit faster. So let's go ahead and go up here to the throttling like I was talking about and make it a fast 3G. So it's a little bit easier to see what's happening as the page is loading. So you can kind of see that there was a blank spot for this image to be able to load into. And typically this type of image would be the largest contentful paint, but it is kind of odd that it's showing, took a while to show that time even though it showed up before that, so that's probably something I would investigate. And I'll show you how we can also identify that this image was the largest contentful paint. Normally on an e-commerce site it is going to be an image, but sometimes if it's on a blog post without a featured image, for example, it'll be a big block of text or like a big headline. But typically if it's collection, homepage, product page, it's going to be an image. that is the LCP. And so you want that to load as early as possible before the other stuff generally, because that gives the user a good idea that the page is loading and they're going to be less likely to get impatient and leave. So the sooner you can show that big important piece of content, the sooner it gives the user something to look at and also be reassured that the page is loading. Now what you might have noticed is you could see the footer up here and then it got pushed down. So because we were able to see the footer and then all of it got pushed down, that's a pretty big shift, almost about half the page. And so that's why we're kind of at this like 0.56, which roughly indicates like a 50%, portion of this page was shifting, is kind of a way to think about it. It's not completely accurate, but that does give you an idea. So see how you can see the keep in touch that's generally at the bottom, and then it's all shifting down. So all that shifting down as these collections are loading in here, these collection items, is causing a big shift. And depending on where I scroll, it might cause an even bigger shift, and I'll show you why that is here in a second. So yeah, you can see down here is the footer. So now check this out. If I go back up to the top and we do a stop and we refresh, and let's say, for example, instead, when I refresh the page here, that I scroll down a bit further, now look how much higher that cumulative layout shift is. The reason why is because pretty much the entire page now is dedicated to that collection stuff loading in, because I chose to scroll down. So that's where the real user CLS might differ from the lab data CLS, because the lab data, when you plug it into these tools, it's not going to emulate scrolling or a user clicking around before things have fully loaded in. So that's why sometimes it's helpful when you're debugging things, especially like CLS, to scroll around and not just leave it loaded up at the top, because remember, a real user won't necessarily just wait. They're going to start trying to click and move things around on the page even if it hasn't fully loaded yet. And so the reason why I wanted to mention that is because we also like using a tool that's a bit more detailed than something like PageSpeed Insights, called WebPageTest.org. And so I ran this before starting this video just to kind of give you an idea, but I went ahead and threw in that collection page. And as you can see, it identified the largest contentful paint as that image, so it'll even point that out for you. But it'll also show things like cumulative layout shift. But you can see here it's showing a much lower cumulative layout shift score. And my guess would be what's happening is the collection stuff isn't fully loading on this test, and you can also see kind of the viewport of this test doesn't even show the collection area, right? So it's not even looking at the part that has the worst CLS, because it's kind of looking at what's happening up above here. And so that's why we're not seeing as much of a CLS issue. And then again here, yeah, it's showing that this is the LCP, and it kind of gives you an idea of what's happening here with the shift. So yeah, here you can see that it's talking about the shift as what's happening here, but as we just identified in this other tool, the CLS is primarily happening below that image. And so that's why it's helpful to use more than one tool when you're looking at these situations. You want to use Search Console to see which URLs are having the biggest issue for your real users based on that rolling 28-day window. Then you want to use a mix of these other tools to kind of debug it and emulate it for yourself, so you can figure out what might be going on and how you could fix it. Now, I do know that recently with Vitamin A, we had a pretty big launch where we changed the way their collection pages were loading. But previously on our graphs, collection pages weren't, showing up. However, in Search Console, it's now kind of pulling up the average. So what could be happening is, in general, there just might be more traffic to these pages, and now it's starting to collect more data, and that's bringing up the numbers. That's one part of it, but I would say another piece of it too here is that the way the collections is loading in, it's a pretty common issue for most Shopify stores, because typically Shopify stores, especially larger ones, are going to use a third party to load in their collections with more features than just a native option. So typically they're using some sort of third party, and so what's happening is that we're prioritizing the way the page loads, and then generally some of the JavaScript or things that power, like these third parties for the collection pages, is going to get deferred because it's not an immediate priority. Again, we're trying to get the majority of the stuff up here above the fold to load so they don't bounce. That's priority number one. The shifting is a much lower priority because most people are going to have a faster connection than this, and it's not really going to be that noticeable. So really there's only a couple of options because again, this is a pretty common issue that we've encountered for CLS on collection pages. You could do a Google anti-flicker, which would basically hide the entire page in like a white until everything is loaded, and then you would reveal the page. So then there would be no shifting, but the big downside to doing that, and why we almost never do that, is then all the content is hidden, and so it makes it seem like the page isn't loading or it's stuck. And that might cause the user to hit refresh, get frustrated, hit the back button, or just leave the site entirely. So again, typically we're going to prioritize things like LCP and FCP and FID, things that measure speed and interactivity, over the visual shifting. Because if the connection's fast enough, the visual shifting really doesn't matter that much. Unfortunately, to Google, it doesn't matter how fast or how slow the shifting is happening. They just look at how much the shifting is happening in order to measure CLS. So it's kind of like we're trying to play a balancing act between the benefit of making the best possible user experience, but also appeasing the Google bots. That way you get the best possible ranking benefit. But I would definitely say that the user experience outweighs the ranking benefit, because we have no idea how much the ranking benefit is. And it's really not worth trying to optimize for a bot necessarily. That definitely isn't going to make a purchase on your site. It's much more important to optimize for the user who's actually going to make a purchase on your site. And so a lot of times these collections, you're using third parties because you want a feature-rich collection option that makes it much easier for consumers to shop, and that's really what we should be optimizing for. So I'm not certain that we'll necessarily do anything to fix this, because again, it is a balancing act, but that is what's going on here on the collection page, and that is something that I'll pass along to our development team and see if maybe there's a way we can kind of balance it a bit better. But I hope this was helpful, and you can see how that if you were to have LCP or FID issues, you would be able to play around with the page too. Now, what's interesting that you'll probably notice is FID didn't show up at all, and that's because I haven't clicked on the page yet. And so in order to emulate that, you have to start clicking around on the page, and then it'll give you an idea of how long it takes the page to respond to that. And so that's how you can get a better understanding of how interactive your site is. For most Shopify sites, unless you have a ton of apps that aren't playing nice together, the FID is kind of like, I would say, like a participation trophy that everybody gets, because it's usually pretty easy to be under 100 milliseconds, again, unless you got something really weird going on with your website. So in order, I would always prioritize LCP. You want to make sure they're seeing something, not going to bounce. Then FID, you want to make sure they can click around and interact on the page. And then CLS last if it is an issue, because again, that it's really a balancing act. We're going after the users versus what the robots are seeing as visual stability. So I hope this video is helpful, and it kind of gave you an idea of some other additional tools that we use here between, kind of using the developer tools in Chrome, as well as WebPageTest.org. So between that, PageSpeed Insights, and Google Search Console, you should be more than prepared to dive into your web performance issues, fix them, and make a super optimized site for your customers. All right, so I hope that example walkthrough that I just did with one of our clients helps you better understand your own web performance and be able to diagnose the issues. But if you'd like us to do it for you, just go ahead and contact me at renderbetter.com, and I'd be happy to help.